Hi everyone, I'm here with Graham Hill today. He's a senior associate with Optimum Partners, and you do a lot of work just in terms of service quality, decisioning, governance. And I know you've had a long background having worked in management consulting advising firms as well.
Yeah,
So Graham, thanks very much for joining me.
thanks for having me.
And we first met really just starting to talk a little bit about value exchange. And I know that's
Yes,
been a term that's been bandied about in terms of open banking in particular, but there's also this little wider piece around value exchange in terms of business. And I know you had some interesting kind of perspectives on that in terms of like how we measure about that and how we think on it.
yes. It is, if you think about it, most of as customers, we have stuff we want to get done. And we interact with others to get access to resources to get those jobs done, those jobs to be
Mm,
done faster, easier, and better.
mm,
And in getting those jobs done and achieving the outcomes we want, that's how we measure success. That is our definition in the simplest terms of value.
mm,
And obviously, there's a whole load of study going back over a long period of time, the concept of axiology, the study of value measurement and value systems. And there are also pragmatic tools or theoretical pragmatic tools, let's put it that way, like service dominant logic, that helps to understand how do we interact with customers, how does that actually work, how do customers measure value, how do we co-create value during those interactions, and that's the sort of work that I've been doing over the last 15 years. Bob Lush and Steve Vargo, who wrote the original paper on service dominant logic in 2004, actually, a long time ago.
mm,
I've been using their thinking ever since. And it is a sort of this value exchange is a foundation of most of my consulting work,
mm,
either implicitly because we're designing communications, for example, that need to share value or products or pricing, or implied in terms of how do you design complex service systems to facilitate the exchange of value, which is what business
mm.
is all about.
Yeah. How common do you find that kind of thinking is? I would say literally I came across it in the open banking world, which is like, why don't people want to use open banking? And it's got to be some sort of value for them, particularly in collections. And then in collections is what's the value in getting people to make a payment as an example? How
Yes,
common do you find that kind of thinking is? Because certainly for me, it came across as a relatively new, I suppose, label for something we probably know about, but it came as a relatively new kind of like theory, really. Do you find
that
it's
is
common in terms of a thinking?
so not common, but getting more common. If I look at service dominant logic as a foundation, the
Mm,
work by Vargo and Lush, that's revolutionized. I think it's not unfair to say it's revolutionized. It's almost a paradigm shift in how service academics think about, or service marketing academics think about value. So
mm,
in the past, it was always about products with the inherent value built in,
mm,
versus these rather tatty second-class citizens of services and experiences, something that's entirely different.
mm,
That's changed with Vargonesi's paper around service dominant logic. There are now thousands of papers out there. What goes into service marketing academia comes out to people like myself who spend a lot of time looking at papers and thinking about how can I apply those things as in experience with my clients into consultants and now into service designers. So I'd say quite a significant proportion of thoughtful service designers have a pretty good understanding of service dominant logic as a way to think about things
mm,
and have a pretty good experience of using tools like Tony Ulrich's jobs to be done
mm,
that I mentioned a second ago. So what a customer's trying to do, not what do they do? You force them to do things they might not want to do, but what are they trying to do?
mm,
And how do they measure success, their desired outcomes, using that as a foundation to understand the value exchange in system logic. So it's becoming more widespread, but it's still relatively, caveat, everybody talks about customer jobs these days. Hardly anybody understands what they're talking about. So it's
mm,
become one of those buzzwords like agile
mm,
that people widely use without understanding the origins of the meaning and how do you actually do it properly. Because there's a huge difference. If you do it properly, it makes a massive difference compared to not doing it properly. For example, work by Tony Ulrich, the guy who trained me in 2009 in Jobs to be Done, one of the founding fathers of Jobs to be Done thinking and outcome-driven innovation. They've done research that shows that if you use a jobs-based outcome-driven innovation approach to innovate new products, services,
mm,
and experiences, you can have an 80% success rate, which is very different to the demonstrable 80% failure rate for most inventions,
mm,
90% for startups that
mm,
we see out there in the big wide world together. So 80% failure rate by having ideas and inventing things, 80% success rate by having a customer-driven innovation approach. That's worth some money.
Yeah. Now, particularly in the UK, with Consumer Duty, it's obviously come in, and this is a wider theme around treating customers fairly, good customer outcomes, I think, just like globally as well. And you see the various regulators sort of building on that. It feels like this is going to become ever more important in terms of how do you generate a good customer outcome? How do you have fair value? And how does that then relate back to the value exchange to a certain
Yeah,
extent? So, are you adding value back to the customer?
yeah,
How do we need to start thinking about that, particularly as we go through our customer journeys and like thinking about what does that relate in terms of good customer outcomes?
yes. That's a very good question, but I think it's a question with a hook in the tail.
Mm,
If I thought I wrote a white paper a year ago now, you go in September, on how do you think about the consumer duty coming introduced by FCA. But don't
mm,
forget they introduced a legislation in 2021 to do with vulnerable customers, which is some similar in many ways and as a precursor to the
mm,
consumer duty. And I thought there were three opportunities that retail financial firms had when it comes to consumer duty. There was an approach which a tiny number might take, which is say we've already done all this because of the vulnerable customer regulations in 2021, so you don't really need to do a great deal now. But I don't think that's really viable personally.
mm,
Then there were two viable approaches. One is what I think of as review. So you're
mm,
going to review our products and our processes and our customer service and our complaints and look at outcomes and compare ourselves with the competitors and blah 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 and make some cosmetic changes like retail
mm,
financial firms usually do when it comes to legislation. It happened with MiFID, happened with GDPR, happened with other things before that. Or there's an alternative approach, which is the renewal approach, which is say, okay, this is a chance to gain a competitive advantage over our competitors
mm,
by becoming more market oriented, so more custom oriented, more competitor oriented, and being really good at bridging the gap between the two through internal capabilities. My expectation was that most retail finance firms would take the review approach, which I think is what they've done,
mm,
and a very small number, hardly any really, have taken the renewal approach and say, okay, let's rethink things around the value exchange and customer outcomes and our outcomes, of course, as well. It's not, oh, we're not a
mm,
charity, we're not trying to give away everything for free. So they left money on the table. So in many ways, the consumer duty for me is unfinished business. Now,
mm,
there was a review a few months ago that the FCA did looking at, they obviously went around looking, bearing in mind the first half of the consumer duty was due to be in by the end of June, I think it was this year, for current products, and the next half, if you like, for the previous products are no longer offered but are still in operation, but by June next year. The FCA carried out a review of what the various retail finance firms have done, and reading between the lines, my take in is they've done what they need to do to, from a compliance perspective, to comply with the legislation. They haven't really picked up this idea that if we understand what customers are trying to do, and why do they interact with us, during which interactions, which touch points, and which journeys, we can make things faster, easier, and better for customers. We make ourselves more productive as well. Because if you think about it, other than financial engineering aside, the only time a company makes money, creates value, or destroys value for the customers or for themselves is when they interact with customers and there's an exchange of value.
mm,
Everything else is a cost.
mm,
Everything. So you only make money when you interact with customers, everything else is a cost. If you don't think about customers' outcomes, you're potentially leaving money on the table.
mm.
And a
And
good
what?
example of that, it
Yeah.
was just one last thing. A few years ago, I did a piece of work for a UK retail bank and looked at their customer journey for mortgages.
Mm,
And it was a marketing program, and we were trying to create a proof of concept for a journey orchestration tool. So I went to the process of mapping out all the interactions in the customer journey from the customer's perspective, not from the bank's perspective, and looking at what collateral, marketing collateral information they provided at each of those stages. And the results were really quite catastrophic in my view. So
mm,
most of what they provided at various interactions was not really fit for purpose in terms of what the customer was looking for. And so the customer, as a result, went looking elsewhere.
mm,
And so there's a whole universe of brokers and third parties providing information that the bank should have been providing, and they would have been provided to taken an outcome-driven innovation or a jobs to be done based approach, but hadn't really picked it up at that point in time,
mm,
leaving the marketplace open to competitors.
mm. And why do you think they haven't taken that sort of review approach? Is it just like fear over the cost, or what's involved in doing this sort of wider kind of like journey mapping? What's been the barrier? Is it time and money, or is the fear justified or not?
That's a very good question. So I've worked lots of banks over the years, and
Mm,
more than a dozen in various countries over the years. And I think about it, they're quite conservative organisations.
mm,
If you look at the recent legislation or the recent opportunity to switch your account, how few people did, even be on the
mm,
basis that what you're going to get elsewhere is basically the same. They have no different real products or services or experiences. It's all more or less the same. Even with the
mm,
new startup banks, it's not that different, or in some cases actually worse. So when you look at
mm,
recent news articles, so I think for most organisations, several things. First of all, they leave things too late.
mm,
So they know this legislation is coming along years in advance often, but they leave it till the last minute to do anything. So I was involved with the MiFID I implementation in the Netherlands a few years ago. My client left it right to the last minute to do the various changes required. And it was quite a big change, MiFID
mm,
I, that they needed to make in terms of how they deal with intermediate business. It's all the same with GDPR. I saw the same with the consumer duty as well. So that's one thing. Second thing is, if you want to go through a renewal process, that implies a lot of change.
mm,
Change is difficult, change is expensive, and large corporations have a history of failing catastrophically
mm,
at change in terms of transformation. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is that all the retail finance institutions or firms are going through a continuous and expensive process of transformation through digitization, just digital transformation, really. Everything is digital since we've been using bits and bytes for decades anyway, but everything's going through a digitization change. Now we've got AI into the mix as well. I think they're busy with other things. So this is just
mm.
another one of those things I need to put tick in the box. I don't want to compete around market orientation. I'm going to compete like I've done all the years in the past, and we'll be fine, and we'll go on to the next piece of legislation in the next whatever period of time it comes.
How much do you think we get guilty of? Oh, you remember the saying around, I think it's how do you eat an elephant? And it's almost, it's slice by slice, I think it is. So
Yes.
how much do you think we get caught up in the fact that things just seem so big, even taking, for example, consumer duty, it just seems so big, and to reinvent everything, it's like, I can't handle that. So I'm just going to basically just tick the box as much as I can versus, is there, do we get caught up in that? And is there an opportunity to look at using these techniques to look at it in a much more sort of smaller bite size kind of way and take it out chunk by
Mm.
chunk?
Another good question. Certainly, it is very complicated.
Mm,
And if you think about if you want to go through a renewal process, so there's a piece of work to be done around analysis and what, but it also implies changing products
mm,
so that they are designed to produce the outcomes that customers want. And bearing in mind, not all customers want the same outcomes. So I need a different variations of products. So I need an object-oriented product catalog
mm,
approach where I can mix and match things. That's radically new. It probably means getting rid of products that aren't really appropriate anymore. That's very
mm,
difficult. Most companies fail to get rid of or excise out old and obsolete products and replace them with the new ones, or when
mm,
they've already been replaced by new ones. It's very difficult. And also, no one person or one organizational part has power over the entire thing. So if you think about the retail finance journey, I've got product development and product management involved. I've got pricing involved, which is usually outside of marketing for
mm,
good or bad reasons. I've then got marketing, sales, and service and operations. And it's a really complicated picture. And it's very hard to make those changes in a organized way unless you really have to.
mm.
As
I
nobody
mean,
really has to make those changes to deal with the compliance for consumer duty, they're going to do what they need to do to get to put the tick in the box. And if they're fortunate and through good design, may generate some advantages in the process compared to the competitors who aren't so careful.
certainly with consumer duty, the spirit of it is to look at some of these things in terms of generating fair value, at least anyway.
Yes.
There's those things. So it does tend towards that kind of route, but probably over the longer term, I feel, rather than it being something that happens immediately. Do you see that sort of companies
Mm,
ever get in there, or do you think this, I've ticked the box,
yes,
so therefore
yes, and
I've done
no.
enough until I need to tick the next box?
Yeah, so look at FCA COBs, the operating
Mm,
model legislation or regulations. TCF, teaching customers fairly, has been around for a long time with its five
mm,
or six principles. I can't remember how many. I think six principles in total. It hasn't really had any other than there's such broad principles that are relatively easy to be able to show that you comply with them. They
mm,
haven't really had all that impact.
mm.
when I look at consumer duty, although I see the emphasis on consumer outcomes as part of that, the legislature didn't really provide a definition of outcomes, which rather leaves it to the, which is not a bad thing. We don't want Cadillac compliance type legislation like we have in the USA, where we have so many rules and such strong penalties for breaking any of them that we get this Cadillac thing that nobody signs up to in the end, a result of shown in various research papers. What I think is that as a result of that, then the opportunities that are afforded by something like consumer duty to think differently and to produce better outcomes just get missed. And they get, as you say, as you imply, kicked down the road. So deal with that later should we get time. But you know what? You never get time because there's more legislation coming along, and there's other CMA legislation coming out. There's going to be coming out shortly that will affect banking consumers as well. There's going to be more FCA regulations that are now picking up some of the progressive issues to do with equality and diversity and what have you, rightly or wrongly. I'm not sure that's really the FCA's remit, but it is currently, which creates more work. And that opportunity to think about the customer and the value exchange gets left to those who own a product or own a journey or own a part of a journey, like onboarding a credit card, for example. And there's another implication, which I think is quite important. If you look at a lot of financial instruments, particularly those used by those who are vulnerable, and there's a statutory definition of vulnerable, there's also I think, a common parlance version, which is a little bit broader. Look at those who have challenges with making good financial decisions, is how I think about vulnerability. Then a lot of products are designed by accident, from what we know today, through behavioral economics, in a way that you wouldn't actually design them that way in order to achieve equitable outcomes. So a simple example, credit card. So we know the impact of buying now and paying later has on overspending. It's been known for a long period of time. It's been well researched by behavioral scientists, and yet we still design credit cards with very little impediment to taking one up that allow people who are vulnerable and have a demonstrable history of difficulties managing their finances to take on board an instrument that will encourage them to overspend. When you have difficulties with being in debt, what do the debt advisors advise you to do? They advise you to take cash and put it in a series of jars marked food and clothing and other things. And when you run out of money, that's it. You've run out of money until next month. Credit cards are designed to overcome that by accident, I suspect, but we know the impact. Nobody thinks about rearranging and redesigning these things. We're creating dark patterns, as Michael Bartlett would describe them.
So if we're sitting there in a business, how do we start thinking about starting some of these processes? And what's almost like the practical advice? Particularly, we do a lot of work in credit risk or in collections and recoveries. How would we start doing that? Because it feels like there's benefit from looking at value exchange, trying to start to mapping that out from a journey. And even if it start making small changes, then that's a step further ahead than reinventing a whole process or a whole product. What's your kind of advice on getting started to think about? Because it does link back to fair value. That's the thing that comes back to me. Right? It's like
everything links to value. I mean, it's price and cost, value and worth. Those four things are all in close proximity with each other. Let me give you an example, something different, but in a way, one thing you might think about doing. So you can't bite off the whole hell of an elephant in one chunk, as you mentioned, Signal. You have to take it in small parts. And I think also that aligns with what we understand about successful change today. So 80% of transformation programs fail, but so do 80% of the introductions of any new technology, whether it's ERP, CRM, CXM, and now data science and AI has still an 80 to 90% failure rate. We know why that is, and part of the reason why is because, first of all, we have two things. First of all, we have a visionary-driven view. So here's where we would like to be in the future. And we've all seen these vision packs from consultants or from our clients. You look and think this is wonderful and this is absolutely fantastic, but we're something completely different. They want us to go to a different planet. How am I going to get there? And they never get implemented as a consequence, because we start the change process from where we are now, an understanding of our constraints that we have, which support or get in our way, one step at a time. So we need to move in what would be called vector-driven change. There's work by David Snowden and Linda Dorr from memory, the Cynefin Institute. So that's one element. And I think the other element is we already know a lot more about customers than we think, but we don't often need information. For example, I just finished doing a piece of work for a European airline.
Mm.
They would need a bit of help looking at recovery in one of their networks that suffered from structural change to customers' behavior. And one part team looked at structural elements of how we encourage customers to fly again. So pricing, all those things. And my job was to look at another part, which is to look at, okay, let's look at a randomized selection of customer verbatim, so complaints, compliments, comments,
Mm.
and they had about 5 to 10,000 a month, so plenty to play with. I took a random sample of those verbatims, literally customer verbatims, mostly complaints, and I used that to extract out of those the jobs to be done that customers are complaining about not getting done,
Mm.
i.e., what's important to customers.
Mm.
And out of that, we found around 80 to 90 core jobs. So things that customers are trying to do and they struggle with, so they tell you about it.
Mm.
Then we used a structured process of identifying what we thought customers' expectations would be to get those jobs done better, just for the top 10 jobs, using a 1990s service
Mm.
quality model, the rater
Mm.
model,
Mm.
so derived from the ServCore work, so reliability, assurance, tangibles, empathy, responsiveness.
Mm.
So we looked at what we for each of those 10 jobs, what customers expect in those things from a combination of working with frontline staff and further analysis of the customer verbatims. Then armed with that understanding of the top 10 jobs, things that they were mostly concerned about, and they covered 75% of all comments about those top 10 jobs. We then identified 60 to 70 very targeted interventions to help customers get their jobs done faster, easier, and
Mm.
better, to solve the problems that attributed that were accounted for 75% of all complaints to the airline.
Mm.
Subsequent to that, I did the same thing for a housing trust in the UK.
Mm.
Same challenge, same approach, obviously different business.
Mm.
I think of the 35 years I've been working in consulting and in service quality, a lot of that time, hardly anybody looks at complaints or
Mm.
comments and analyzes them properly to identify the customer's jobs, what they're trying to do.
Mm.
There's there's a difference between what they do and what they're trying to do.
Mm.
So we create complicated processes, experiences for customers to go through. Our pathways, as I think about them, they don't make any sense to the customer and often don't make any sense to the company either, but they've been there for a long period of time. So
Mm.
we just do them that way. And that's what we force them to do. The customers want to do something different
Mm.
often. So by understanding what they want to do and how they measure success, expectations, we have the best possible foundation to identify what to do differently. It's our job to do, that's not the customer's
Mm.
job, and to produce improvements as a consequence, either large improvements or lots and lots of small ones. My preference is for the latter.
It seems to me like there's almost like four categories. And going back to your white paper or future vision documents, which they're a bit like the concept cars in
Yes.
financial services or consultancy, aren't they? I mean,
Yeah.
they put out there, but there's almost like what we think customers want, what customers think they actually want, what we're actually going to give them as a
Yes.
business, and then what they actually want. And some of those things may intersect, or they might not intersect at all. What a customer actually thinks that they actually want might not be actually what they end up really deep down wanting or
It's
needing to get the job done to a certain
it's
extent.
there's a fantastic cartoon image called The Project,
Mm.
and it says what the customer wanted, and it was basically a swing on a tree.
Yeah,
Then it was like what the analyst designed, what you got billed by the
yeah,
consultants is like huge roller coaster,
yeah,
and customer support, which was basically a burnt tree. You're describing that basically. So
yeah.
this is why we've been looking at ways to understand customers' needs and wants for a long period of time. And the challenge we have is there's too much noise. So
Mm.
if you ask as a not in a not a non-market research what they want, they'll tell you about their needs, things I
Mm.
must be able to do, things they want, things I would like to be able to do. They'll think about features and attributes and all sorts of other things as well. And you go with that information to marketing to think, oh, we need to communicate better. You go to sales, oh, we need a new product. Go to customer service, well, that's going to be another town, another country
Mm.
probably. then they have a different opinion. There's too much noise. When Tony Ulrich created the Jobs to be Done concept some 25 years ago, with it came a simple structured language to capture a customer job
Mm.
and to capture a customer desired outcome, an expectation, if you like. Those things are readily adaptable into use cases, customer jobs,
Mm.
and into customer requirements in terms of desired outcomes. By creating this common language, all of that, the cacophony that we hear otherwise when you go to talk different perceptions, disappear.
Mm.
And that's a really fundamental part of capturing what customers want using job statements and outcome statements, using the outcome-driven approach from Tony Ulrich. Uh, it's in my experience, I've been in this for I was trained in 2009, and I've seen lots of different innovation approaches over the years,
Mm.
from open innovation through to lead user innovation, what have you. It's by far the most effective way that I've ever
Yeah.
seen to do innovation and understand what customers really want at the fuzzy front end.
Yeah, I'm just looking at. I was thinking you're making me think of social media actually. In terms of if you were
Mhm.
to ask me, what do I want to see on my TikTok account, as an example, I would
Yeah.
give you some stuff around. I
How
don't know.
how would you know?
So I would tell you what I wanted in terms of, it might be science, it might be news, it might be certain particular topics, but then what do I actually click on and what do I actually need to look at will be actually quite different. And then certainly if you
Yes.
look at my algorithm, it seems very different. And there's
Yes.
almost like this perception, almost like even in our own brains internally, the conflict between what I think I want and what I actually want, or what I think I need versus what I actually need to get stuff done. And I suppose
Yes.
it must be quite interesting with data these days to be able to almost unbundle some of those. I mean, I suppose the difference
Yes. I
between
think so.
marketing and operations to a certain
Yeah.
extent.
I think the over the years, look, we're doing this for a long time now, looking at customer jobs,
Mm.
and we know that the jobs, by and large, do not change over time. What
Mm.
changes is the tools we've got to use to do
Mm.
them, and our expectations of how they will work. So if you think
Mm.
back a long time ago, when you in your great grandfather's time, no doubt in
Mm.
your great grandfather's stately home,
Mm.
when he wanted music,
Definitely
he'd
not.
hire a string quartet to come and
Yeah.
entertain in the parlour,
Yeah.
before the gentlemen went off to have port and the ladies went off to do
Yeah.
knitting or do embroidery in those days. And
Yeah.
then, of course, along came 78s and
Yeah.
then 45s, then 33s, and then tapes,
Yeah.
and then CD-ROMs or
Mm.
whatever, and then iPods until you got Spotify. It's the same job. Listen to music whilst at home, but I can also listen to music while I'm traveling. Something I can't do with string quartet. And I can also collate and organize jobs. There's a whole load of associated jobs I can do at the same time. Our our jobs don't change, the tools do, and what we expect, how we expect them to work changes as a consequence.
Mm.
So social media, just another example of that we have communications jobs, and rather than write to your aunt or pick up the telephone, I remember the days of landlines, shared landlines, and I had to pick up the
Yeah.
telephone on our farm at home and then make sure I hope the neighbour over the road wasn't using on his farm wasn't using the same
Yeah.
telephone line.
Yeah.
And now we've got social media. Now, if I want to send the gas meter reading to the gas company, I send them a WhatsApp message
Yeah.
with a picture of the meter. That's all I need to do, and they do all this themselves.
Yeah.
So as you say, same job, communication, different tool, different expectations.
That's interesting. We think the world changes a lot, but actually a lot of it doesn't change a lot. It's just the
Precisely,
speed and the tools change, right? So.
precisely. And sometimes we change the person doing the job. So you take on a job that somebody else might have
Mm.
done in the past. So
Mm.
good cases. I was looking at something and the strategy in ODI stuff a little while ago. In the olden days, if you wanted to, when you have go to your annual checkup with your dentist, they would clean your teeth and whiten your teeth as a consequence because
Mm.
of all the tea and whatever you'd had in the meantime. Today you have the whitening strips that
Mm.
you use yourself if you're interested in those sorts of things. So you've taken on a new job that previously would belong to somebody else, somebody
Mm.
else's job.
Mm.
And often you're going to use a new platform to do things as well, so that you can do things yourself. And social media is a good example of a different platform to do the same job that somebody else would have done in the past, or you'd
Mm.
have done in the past, but use a different platform.
Mm.
And of course, today we have multi-sided markets.
Mm.
So it's not only you use a platform provided by company A to do something you're going to do with them in a different way in the past anyway. Now you're going to platform, and platforms are things that bring together millions of customers with thousands of providers who normally wouldn't meet.
Mm.
Amazon, eBay, credit card, frequent flyer programs are all examples of technology powered multi-sided markets.
Mm.
We come together to do things that we couldn't do in the past because we didn't know these other people.
Mm. So One question I have, so I know you do work outside of the UK, you do work a lot of stuff internationally as well, which is consumer duty is obviously UK legislation,
Mhm.
but how much do you see this working in other markets where you work? I think the value exchange stuff doesn't change. We're all kind of
No,
humans.
yes.
How do you sort of rate like different levels of adoption and different levels of thinking in terms of markets that are good versus markets maybe that are developing, those kind of things? Do you have any kind of perspective on that?
That's a good question. I do live abroad. I live in Germany. I've lived here for 30 years, so I have but most of my work has been in the UK in the past. Although I've worked in, I think it was last time I looked at, something like 15 or 20 different
Mm,
countries around the world. There are certainly differences, and those differences are cultural differences. Geert Hofstede wrote a book about called Culture's Consequences in the 1980s, which I used to use
mm,
in the past. It looked at 5 different factors that you can use to different how different cultures relate to each other, how they relate people in those cultures relate to each other, power distance things, all sorts of different factors. So there are different cultures when it comes to expectations of service, and maybe we all know that all about America's legendary friendliness of
mm,
service. But if you go to Asian countries like Japan, so the Japanese have a concept called omotenashi.
mm,
I used to work for Toyota, so we used to talk about omotenashi and Lexus. We used to talk about omotenashi sometimes. Omotenashi is the art of being a good host,
mm,
and exemplified in the Japanese tea ceremony.
mm,
And part of that is understanding in detail your guest who's going to be coming, and understanding what they're really like, and arranging those things so that when they do come to you, you get everything they really is there, and it runs really smoothly
mm,
with an amount of simple flair that somehow only the Japanese manage to do.
mm,
You can contrast that with some European, historical anyway, European companies. So they always talk in Deutschland, Germany about being a service Wüste, a
mm,
service desert,
mm,
where you don't get much service because it's not the way things are. I think it's quite true. I think there's elements of that, but it's not as true as it used to be. But if you contrast that, maybe some of the cultures where service isn't really part of things, part of daily business at all, with Japan and one end of the
mm,
extreme, and companies in Asian countries along. And I was lived in Singapore for a while, and they're also very extremely service oriented. So there are clear differences. But at the end of the day, as you quite rightly pointed out, the thing that knits them all together is the value exchange.
mm,
And of course, what I value. So things that I value aren't always getting functional things done.
mm,
I also value there are also things, jobs that I have that are emotional, how I want to feel about myself,
mm,
and social, how I want to be seen by others. And the example I always use when I teach people about or train people in jobs to be done is, if you think about transportation. If I want to get from A to B, then a very simple Dacia
mm,
car will get me there really quickly and easily without any problem at all. But if I want an emotional job, I feel really good about myself, then I might want to have something a little bit, maybe a Range Rover,
mm,
because it won't get me there any faster, any better on average. Certainly not if you live in London with the average speed of 11 miles an hour.
mm,
But you're saying something about yourself. I've made it. I'm successful. I can afford a Range Rover
mm,
and pay the congestion charge in London. But then there's social jobs about how to be seen by others. So rather than a Range Rover, what if I got a Lamborghini?
mm,
People look at Lamborghini and they already have. There's always you see Lamborghini in either to a drug dealer, or they're very successful in life because they can
mm,
afford a Lamborghini and they have the
mm,
style and the flair to drive one.
mm,
So we have social and emotional jobs as well as functional jobs. They're all part of the rich mixture of understanding what customers value. It's
mm.
only about getting stuff done.
Yeah, and I suppose if it comes down to that, going back to the value exchange piece, and just take an example, use an example, historical example of Germany, the way it used to be, and maybe it's just much more pragmatic around getting the job done, as rather than and
It
that's what's
is
being valued, rather than
very
say in
good
Japan,
point.
where it's actually what's being valued there is actually the service and how I feel about it, and that might have changed since, and I
Yeah.
do think it's been changing as we sort of
Yes and
globalize, but
yes and no. So I was looking at the syllabus a little while ago of a friend who is doing a training to become a degree in the sports industry.
mm,
I was looking at the marketing syllabus in German,
mm,
and I was quite surprised and taken aback for a
mm,
second by the difference between service, Dienstleistung, providing the mechanics of providing a service,
mm,
and the emotional element of service. Now, as Anglo-Saxon people, as Brits, we take the two things be inextricably linked.
mm,
you provide a service, and
mm,
there's an emotional element that comes with it in terms of not only providing the physical elements of ABC of the service, the process,
mm,
but also being friendly towards the customer.
mm,
The message in the German textbook
mm,
is that they are different, and you focus on the
mm,
process,
mm,
and the service is almost optional, but the process is what matters.
mm,
So you get this thing where you go to German shops, sometimes more in the past, whereby you get a very rigid process, but they weren't necessarily very friendly. And if they were going to the process to close the shop,
mm,
half an hour before the shop was due to close, and you had cash in your hand to buy an item, they would
mm,
decline
mm,
because they were now closing the shop. And you're, who do you think? I'm just a bloody customer.
mm,
On the other extreme, where they place so much emphasis not only on the service but also on the human element, the Japanese omotenashi approach,
mm,
um, Lexus competes on omotenashi,
mm,
the pursuit of perfection in the service relationship, much more
mm,
than any other luxury brands I've ever had the privilege of working with. So we do have that extreme whereby in the middle we take it as Anglo-Saxons, we take service as a process and service as an experience, if you like, for granted. In some countries, Germany in the past, the service as a process is more important than the experience. And in some countries on the other extreme, like Japan, perhaps, certainly in the past, then the process already worked anyway because it's Japan, but the emphasis was on the experience that you
mm,
have, make that as sublime as possible.
mm. It does feel over the last sort of 10 or even 15 years that's those sort of differences have been eroding. And the other comment I was going to make is when you get to know countries a little bit more, it's never quite as simple as from
Of
an
course, not.
outsider you look at it, and actually every country's a lot of people you get countries people of all sorts in every single country,
Actually,
and sort of and it's way more complicated than almost like we have this simplistic views from the
of
outside
course,
as well.
we are simplifying speeches. We spot patterns and we
Yeah,
simplify them around
yeah.
our prejudice we already had before we actually
Yeah.
spotted the patterns.
And I'll just say I don't have tea with the Queen every afternoon, but that's country. But it does feel like it's like we're going towards a much more. It's becoming more homogenized in terms of being more. There's more
I think so.
similarities seem to be growing in terms of how we
I think
relate
so.
to each other as well.
But which I think, if you think about it, with the globalization of technology, if I think of call center customer service, I don't think about a German or UK firm. I think about Land's End.
Mm,
You call into Land's End, and it is the most sublime experience you can possibly have in customer service. Like they can't do enough to help you,
yeah.
just to buy another pair of trousers or a jacket because it's going to be cold
Mm,
soon. So those things come in. This was my point earlier on, that the jobs don't change,
mm,
but the tools we use change, and our expectations of service. This is the old Kano model thinking. The
mm,
things that yesterday we took for were really differentiators. Today are table stakes, and tomorrow they are things that we can disrupt and remove without any problems because
yeah.
nobody really needs them anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. So where do we go from here? What do you see as the outlook being in terms of, I suppose, value exchange, but then also thinking about products? What's the trajectory, do you think?
So I think my belief is that it'll get worse before it gets any better. So if I look
Mm,
at for example, the Customer Service Institute produces a UK CSI score every year, and as does the ACSI in the USA, customer satisfaction. And it's been falling quite a bit over the last few months and years, and it's
mm,
reached its lowest point in the last, I think, when I looked recently, it was since 2008 from memory. It is
mm,
now the lowest point since 2008. So it's certainly a very low point in time, driven by COVID, which has allowed a lot of companies to remove service and use COVID as an excuse. All they do is cutting costs,
mm,
and driven by other complexities as well. So I think my belief is that the service element and value exchange is about service, providing resource for the benefit of another. That's the definition of a service. So
mm,
value exchange is about swapping service, swapping resources in that way to create value. So I think it's going to get worse for a period of time until companies like they do. You can cut so far, then you start to realize that, you know what, there's actually an advantage becoming more customer oriented,
mm,
bearing in mind what competitors are doing, so doing better than they are, but not overdoing it,
mm,
and creating value in the process. So I think what we'll find in the next year or maybe year and a half, that somebody will start to realize we've cut back on customer service. We've
mm,
saved a lot of costs. But we've now worked out how to do remote service provision because people are now working from home rather than working in a call center somewhere potentially. We now recognize there's an advantage to be gained
mm,
in providing a higher competitive level of customer service than the alternatives available.
mm,
And we see this cycle of waxing and waning of customer service, of service quality,
mm,
really. That's what it's all
mm.
down to, wrapped up in the guise of customer experience.
Yeah.
So
I
if,
suppose
if I
we're waiting
if
for
I
that
think of
wheel to turn, aren't we? Yeah, to a certain
precisely,
extent.
so, but it's no different to recession. We have a recession, everything gets cut. We'd go
Mm,
through process engineering, and then at the end of the recession, we start to grow and expand, and it's no different in some ways.
mm,
Except one thing I have noticed, though, there's this been an explosion since late 1990s, or no, probably 2010, 2028 or 29, 2008, 2009, when Pine and Gilmore wrote the book, The Experience Economy, which kicked off the
mm,
customer experience revolution. When you read the book, and I remember reading when I was on holiday in the south of France avidly, because it's going
mm,
to be the next big thing, and I was correct, it was the next big thing.
mm,
The emphasis there is on the experience as theatre to some extent,
mm,
so creating happy memories, if you like.
mm,
And I think that's distracted a lot of companies. They're now thinking
mm,
about how do we create memorable experiences rather than
mm,
customers don't come to memory experiences, they come for service.
mm,
They want to get access to stuff to help them get their jobs done and get their desired outcomes faster,
mm.
even better.
Yeah.
If you do that, you get an experience in the process anyway, whether you like it or not, because you
Yeah.
co-create that experience by interaction you have with a person, a company, a machinery, or whatever it may be. We've lost track of the quality of service driver of customer experience. Once we focus on this peripheral element of memorable experiences, and so often what I see today is I see the marketing, the sizzle
Mm,
of the customer experience being advertised. When I go to consume that service, the steak, the
mm.
bit you go for is missing. You get a
Yeah.
rotten service dressed up in this nice fluffy experience wrapped around it. It doesn't work. People go for
Yeah.
service to get an experience. So give them the damn service in the first place. Design it to be faster, easier, and better than competitors.
Yeah, and that's definitely good advice in the digital world that we've been going into, and all the investment around that in terms of like,
Yes.
is it just a cover that's sitting on the top, or is it actually a little bit more fundamental in terms of, as you'll say, that sort of that value exchange down at the
Yeah.
more sort of detailed
But
kind of product level?
and the digital is going to kick in. I'm not talking about AI in this particular case. Is going to introduce a whole new way of thinking. So in the past, we talked about inbound and outbound communications with customers. They talk to
Mm,
us through the call center, through an email or a letter,
mm,
and we talk to them through communications or outbound calling, whatever. But most customers don't by and large don't care much for marketing and sales.
mm,
That's not it's non-value adding. It's just a chore they have
mm,
to go through to get something. The value for customers is when they start to use the product or the service they bought to get their
mm,
jobs done and desired outcomes done
mm,
satisfactorily. So all the value is in use,
mm,
not in ownership or buying up.
mm,
So companies focus on all those things in marketing and sales,
mm,
and they neglect the usage experience.
mm,
And that's where the battle. So technology allows the customer to drive much more of that user experience themselves, to change settings and parameters and make interactions so that we can manage things dynamically.
mm,
This is the future battleground of
mm,
retail financial services, is in the usage experience, not in marketing,
mm,
not in sales, not in customer service. It's all going to be about the user experience, and technology is absolutely critical
mm,
to manage those interactions and making those interactions into a coherent journey,
mm.
orchestrating that journey for value for both customers and for banks as well.
Yeah, I suppose making it seem, I mean, that'll be music to a lot of people's ears, just in
Yeah,
terms
I
of
think
just trying
so.
to
It should be. But you know,
make it
not rocket
processing.
science.
Yeah,
It's common sense. Why
yeah,
isn't it so
yeah,
common?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, Graham, thanks very much for making the time. We said we'd have enough to talk about, so we
Oh,
definitely had enough,
go on for
more than enough,
days.
more than enough to talk about. So I appreciate your insights. It's fascinating. It definitely gets me thinking about value exchange, how to think about it, a bit of a framework of thinking about it as well.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit different than we might hear elsewhere. So I
Yes.
really appreciate you making the time.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, Chris.
Thank you.